The Middle Ages conflict. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe and give examples of different types of conflicts that occurred in the Middle Ages. These conflicts will include military, religious, and economic conflicts. This is really considered to be an age of conflict. It begins with the fall of the Roman Empire due largely to invasions from surrounding tribes. And as periods of conflicts continue as groups attacked Western Europe on three sides: the Vikings from the north, the Magyars from the east, and Muslims from the south. Because of the conflict, people lived in sort of a constant state of warfare, and there was a need for security and protection. So vassals would pledge themselves to nobles. The nobles built massive castles as fortresses for defense, and people saw the development of a lot of different fighting strategies and techniques, including the use of saddle and stirrups to help keep the nobles' warriors, the knights mounted on horseback. Defenders of castles would pour boiling water, hot oil, molten lead down on their enemy attackers. Crossbows were used that could pierce full armor. Siege towers, like the one you see in the picture, were constructed so that attackers could get over the castle walls. Attackers also used shields so that they could advance their positions in a protected place. Battering rams were used to break down the walls, and catapult devices could sling materials up to 1,000 yards and sometimes a little bit further in an effort to break down these castle defenses. Probably the most famous conflicts of the Middle Ages are the Crusades, which are a series of European military expeditions against Islamic power in the Middle East. Muslims were trying to defend their territory against European invasion, and Europeans were trying to conquer what they believed to be Christian territory. This is a combination of religious, territorial, and political conflict. A European leader would ask for help, and an army would be raised, so people would go fight. There were a number of factors that led people to participate in the Crusades. First of all, knights and vassals had no choice. If the lord to whom they were pledged said it was time to go fight, they did. If the Pope issued a call, the fighting was considered a holy pilgrimage, and participants could earn official forgiveness for sins. Participants sometimes were eager to get rich and earn a share of the plunder or treasure that might come from defeating one of these empires. Merchants were looking for new trading opportunities, and some people joined just because they wanted to travel and see places they had never seen before. The First Crusade led to the establishment of 4 Christian states in the Eastern Mediterranean near modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. This was symbolic because it returned the city of Jerusalem to Christian control. But to do that, there was a terrible massacre of the inhabitants of the city. The Second Crusade was largely a failure, an attempt to retake Damascus. The Third Crusade, Jerusalem had fallen under Muslim control again, and it was a campaign to regain access to Jerusalem led by 3 of Europe's leaders: Richard I of England, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and Philip II Augustus of France. And they initially were successful along the coast, but they couldn't make any progress inland. Frederick actually died during this campaign. Philip got mad and went home. And in the end, Richard was able to negotiate free access to Jerusalem for Christians, but wasn't actually able to reconquer the city. There are some crusades that occur after this time, including a children's crusade where most of the children who volunteered to go died on the way, but in large part these crusades were unsuccessful. The impact of the Crusades is that they expanded trade, but that was going to happen anyway, most likely. They increased the persecution of Jews and Muslims, the Muslims specifically in Spain, but it seemed to make sense to people in Europe at the time that if they could fight these so-called holy wars against Muslims, that they could also target Jews who they believed had martyred the Messiah, and that made the persecution of the Jews justifiable. It shifted the balance of power from nobles and feudal systems to kings, because the kings were largely the ones who were leading these crusades, and it somewhat undermines the power and authority of the Pope and the Church, as the crusades were largely unsuccessful. There are other religious issues and conflicts at this time. Priests were marrying and having families, which was against the official church doctrine. There was a practice called simony, where bishops sold positions in the church. There's also a practice called lay investiture, where kings were able to appoint bishops. And the problem the church had with this is that the kings were secular or political leaders. The bishops were considered to be religious leaders. And they go back and forth arguing about who has this authority until an agreement is reached called the Concordat of Worms. And it says that the church, the religious leadership, is responsible for appointing the bishops, but kings can veto those appointments. There's also a division in the papacy, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope at this time. And for a period of almost 70 years, the center of the papacy was relocated from Rome to Avignon. And then after that, there was a period of time where there were actually two popes, a French one serving in Avignon and an Italian one serving in Europe. This was called the Great Schism. All of these things worked together to weaken the influence of the church and eventually to cause people to ask for serious church reforms. There's an economic struggle going on in this time period as well. Most people associate the Middle Ages with wealthy lords and ladies living in castles, but they're really a very small minority of the population. Most people struggled to survive. The majority were peasants. Within this group of peasants, a serf was a person who was bound to the land where he or she was born. They were not free to leave the land. And although they could not be bought and sold, so they weren't technically slaves, they really lived a pretty miserable existence because they had to stay and work on the land where they'd been born. Peasants and serfs owed their lords labor and a portion of their harvest, which they paid in as a tax. They also had to pay taxes to grind their grain at the lord's mill, to get married, and they could only do that with the lord's consent, and they had to pay 10% of their overall income in tithes to the church. They lived in 1 to 2 room cottages that were pretty dark and miserable and not very secure from the weather and other elements. Lots of times the beds were made of hay and straw, and they were infested with bugs. And they encountered a lot of illness and malnutrition, simply not getting enough to eat. And life expectancy was about 35 for this group of people. The period closes, the Middle Ages, with a very famous and protracted war called the 100 Years' War between France and England. And what really comes out of the series of conflicts between these two countries are 3 things. First of all, the longbow was developed, which allowed people to fight at a greater distance, and it kind of marks the end of the use of knights and chivalry for making war. Joan of Arc is a leader in the French efforts, even though she winds up being executed because of her religious beliefs. She claimed that she heard voices and saw visions that directed her to tell the French army what to do and where to move, and that was considered heresy against the church doctrine, and she was executed. The 100 Years' War also leads to a rise of nationalism. People really began to focus on a king as a single national leader, and power shifted away from the feudal lords. This is the end of the video on conflict in the Middle Ages. If you need to run it back or watch it again, feel free to do so. Thanks.